for the U.S. Chamber to host the CEO Summit, it's been a really important opportunity for us to bring our members and businesses and networks to the table. Over the past 2 days, the CEO Summit has provided a platform for productive and insightful discussions featuring many of you, many of the leaders in this room, and CEOs and executives from some of the world's most exciting companies. And maybe most importantly, for small and medium-sized enterprises that are the primary generators of growth across our hemisphere. Every day, these companies, large and small, not only produce all of the goods and services we depend on, but they solve problems, they serve people, and they strengthen society. The business community stands in partnership with you in addressing the challenges before all of us. We focused on several of those challenges during the CEO Summit, each an opportunity for the public and private sectors to work together and drive action. I'll just say a quick few words about each. And if they sound familiar, they should, because we intentionally aligned the CEO Summit agenda with your priorities. The first is promoting a strong rule of law throughout the region. This is essential to making progress on any of the priorities for a really simple reason. Where robust institutions thrive, businesses and workers thrive. The private sector will support and build on important initiatives like the Alliance for Development and Democracy. We applaud the governments of Panama, the Dominican Republic, and Costa Rica for working collaboratively to strengthen democratic institutions and enhance transparency and predictability for companies. We will help demonstrate how their efforts will lead to new investment and more resilient supply chains. As the State Department announced earlier this week, the U.S. Chamber will undertake an assessment of hemispheric supply chains by surveying CEOs and chief logistics officers. We hope to help identify companies' priorities, analyze trade flows, and assess opportunities across our whole region. We look forward to launching this survey at an event bringing together businesses and leaders from the Alliance for Development and Democracy. Next is boosting trade. Trade doesn't just bring prosperity, it strengthens the ties of partnership and stability. Businesses import and export, make investments, and build supply chains, but we need our partners in government to help set the conditions for success. We will also continue to ensure that small and medium-sized businesses reap the benefit of greater economic engagement. This week, the U.S. Chamber and our member companies were proud to host a virtual SME Trading Academy. More than 3,000 small businesses from 20 different countries participated. We want to build on that success, work with our member companies and other partners to expand it so we can talk to more and more small and medium-sized companies in your countries. Third, the CEO Summit focused on building resilient health systems throughout the region. The U.S. government's newly announced America's Rise initiative is an important step forward. Our member companies have been pushing for that initiative. We want to formalize a regional public partnership and dialogue on the really important conversation on healthcare. The private sector has committed to bolstering that work. Our foundation at the Chamber will stand up a new Reliance Operations Center of the Americas to serve as a real virtual hub. So the next time a crisis hits, whether that's a natural disaster, whether that's a pandemic, there is a hub that we can go to support each other. Next, we know that we all have to support digital innovation, which supports greater growth, transparency, and, importantly, economic inclusion throughout the region. For our part, business is committed to work diligently to close the digital divide while advancing technologies, as we all saw accelerated in the pandemic. And we will work with your governments to establish consistent regulatory frameworks that will help expand connectivity and foster digital transformation. Finally, as we all know, we must work together to address the energy crisis that's confronting our region. We need to accelerate the production needed to drive down energy costs while continuing private sector-led innovation and investment needed for the energy transition. We can and we must do both to help families, businesses, to help strengthen our energy security in a volatile geopolitical environment, and to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Ladies and gentlemen, all of us share a common destiny. In a lot of ways, we rise and fall together as a region. We know that we can't solve every problem here this week, but the business community joins you with a commitment to drive progress, a commitment to the hard work, and a commitment to sustained action. This summit might be a moment in time, but it can set the course for action for months and years to come. And though we have spent a lot of time at this summit talking about the challenges, let's not forget about the opportunities. We have an opportunity to come back from the pandemic stronger than ever. Our hemisphere can be a leading exporter of energy, a premier destination for travel and tourism, and a model for human rights, the rule of law, and the prosperity that flows from each. We can do this. We can do it together. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce stands ready to work with each of you to do just that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzanne. The chair now recognizes the Honourable Gaston Brown, Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary of State. I acknowledge my colleague heads, excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. While I'll register my regret that invitations to this 9th Summit of the Americas were not extended to all heads of government, I acknowledge that the crucial issues confronting our global community demand our urgent and collective attention. It is my hope that there will be no future summits to which any head of government of our Americas will be omitted. Indeed, we regard the trade embargo against Cuba as harmful to the promotion of peace and prosperity in this hemisphere. It should be ended. Similarly, we urge engagement with the government of Venezuela, allowing the country to use its resources for its people's needs and to play a peaceful and constructive role in our region. To achieve this, there is work to be done by all sides to narrow differences and establish cooperation in the interests of advancing economic, social, and political well-being of all the peoples of this hemisphere. Right now, there's a confluence of troubling global events that require our collective and strong leadership to recover from COVID-19 pandemic, to respond adequately to climate change, and to surmount the challenges of food insecurity and escalating oil prices. The inflationary pressures are driving tens of millions of people in our hemisphere into abject poverty, requiring greater hemispheric cooperation on solidarity. As leaders, we must act urgently to bring the rising cost of living under control. However, the reality is that no one country can overcome these challenges. The widest possible hemispheric and international cooperation to mobilize our collective resources behind a clear plan of action is vital and must be encouraged and pursued. While I do not expect that this summit can produce a definitive plan, I hope that at least we can agree on its elements, including the identification of priorities and practical measures that can be implemented. Colleagues, we are at a defining moment. All of us need to summon the political will to act, and to act with purpose. Beyond the new and urgent challenges that confront us all, there are others that have lingered and festered for far too long. The important truth emanating from COVID-19 that no one is safe until all is safe applies equally to the overarching threat of climate change, to the conditions of underdevelopment that lead to irregular migration and refugees, to inappropriate and inadequate criteria for access to concessional financing, and to de-risking and financial exclusion of small economies from the international financial system. I draw special attention to the fact that for decades, the effects of climate change have repeatedly caused loss and damage to small states without any compensation. Our countries have suffered and continue to suffer, even though we are the least contributors to the cause of climate change. This is one of the greatest injustices that exist today. and it requires the attention of the United States and others. If we learn nothing else from the COVID-19 pandemic, it should be that we cannot legislate against cross-border effects of global issues, nor can we build walls to exclude them, or establish border patrols to turn them back. Lip service, neglect, and national interests may serve the wealthier countries among us for some time, but eventually, deteriorating conditions in the neighborhood will engulf us all unless we act, and we act now. What is urgently required is genuine international cooperation to remedy these ills, which have persisted relentlessly, forcing many small states to cope by borrowing on commercial terms. This borrowing to repeatedly repair infrastructure damaged by the impact of climate, and more recently, to finance extraordinary expenditure incurred in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, has enlarged our debt burden, leaving little fiscal space to build resilience and to construct the necessary physical infrastructure. In this connection, my government welcomes President Biden's announcement of a new America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity. My government is particularly pleased that President Biden's America's Partnership aims to mobilize new financing and to revitalize multilateral development banks, revamping their lending policies to better meet the specific needs of the majority of our nations. I remind, however, that many Caribbean countries have exhausted their borrowing capacity to respond to these exogenous shocks and need debt relief and post-COVID recovery assistance to shore up their tattered economies. Therefore, contracting more debt is not the answer. I also remind that, for no good reason, 6 CARICOM countries are denied membership of the Inter-American Development Bank, and therefore, access to their lending and investment. My government encourages President Biden to include in this new partnership the U.S. joining other developmental partners as a member of the Caribbean Development Bank, which services all CARICOM countries and is indispensable to our needs. My government applauds and celebrates renewed, reinvigorated, and sustained U.S. attention to the mutual economic prosperity of the U.S. and the nations of our hemisphere. President Biden is providing much appreciated leadership in this regard. But we recognize that the United States alone cannot do everything. Hence, we urge cooperation between the United States government and the other governments, such as China, which is playing a constructive role throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. In the areas of infrastructural development and the build-out of renewable resources of energy, collaboration between the US and China could accelerate the pace of economic transformation within our hemisphere. Colleagues, this summit should be remembered as the one which we got together as leaders of the Americas, confronted the barriers to the economic progress and prosperity of the large American family, and decided to act decisively to overcome them. That will be achieved not by declarations that we will issue, but by the actions we take to implement them faithfully and expeditiously. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. The Chair now recognizes the Honorable Philip Davis, Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas and Minister of Finance.
Secretary of State Tony Blyton, colleagues, prime ministers and presidents, delegates and representatives, citizens of the Bahamas and the wider Americas. Colleagues, I have come to Los Angeles, California, the city of angels, inspired by the words of the father of my nation, who once said, he searched for the heart and soul of the Americas. Today, the Americas are challenged by crises: climate, COVID, and conflict have undermined our safety and our security. Have we done enough here at this gathering to relieve suffering, to promote peace, to fight for the economic dignity of our people? All the work and all the fine words do not count for much unless we can tell our people, whether they live in Old Bite Island in the Bahamas, in Bridgetown, Barbuda, or in Santiago, Chile, that we laid a true foundation for their progress. Of course, the real test will come when we all go our separate ways. Will the work we carried out here continue once the spotlight and the world's attention have moved on? Given that it's almost impossible to overstate what's at stake, we must hope that the answer to that question is yes. As we are aware, change is certain, but progress is not. It should be sobering for us all that the issues we are confronting at the Summit of the Americas are more dire and more urgent than those discussed at the first such summit 3 decades ago. That is evidence that the good intentions and the optimism of that gathering did not translate into enduring progress. Indeed, some countries in our hemisphere have become more unequal and more violent. Across the Americas, the scourges of racism and discrimination appear to be on the rise. Emerging moral and technological challenges to our democratic norms threaten our capacity to deliver free and fair elections and effective governance. And all these challenges are eclipsed by the existential threat of climate change. What each of these challenges have in common is that they cannot be solved by any one nation alone. For that reason, we offer President Biden and Vice President Harris and the people of the United States our warmest thanks and appreciation for their promotion of dialogue and cooperation and their hospitality. Multilateral engagement at the highest levels happens too infrequently, certainly when it comes to issues which are important to the Caribbean. But if the work of this summit continues, if the will to cooperate endures, if words turn into action, change can lead to progress, and we can move forward. Friends, June 1st marked the beginning of hurricane season. It is hard to describe what it's like to live in and lead a country that is several storms, or maybe even just one more Category 5 storm away from destruction. Even now, we are locked in a vicious cycle of devastation and recovery. In the last 20 years, at least 11 major storms have made landfall in the Bahamas. More than half of my country's debt can be directly linked to hurricanes. That means that the world's failure to slow carbon emissions constrains the decisions we make in the Bahamas every day. As hurricanes become more frequent and more intense, the waters and seas rise, and so do our debts. Yet, we need resources to make our infrastructure and our homes more resilient. That is why my country has advocated for the creation of dedicated, accessible, and affordable climate financing. Our seagrass and mangroves are playing, and that conservation and restoration can continue to play a critical role in acting as a carbon sink. These blue marine ecosystems capture up to dozens of times the amount of carbon as tropical rainforests. Carbon markets are an important bridge to a net zero future, and we will be the first country in the world to develop and trade blue carbon credits. Friends, at the summit, we have spoken much about the threats that cross borders, from viruses to carbon emissions to inflationary pressures to trafficking. Another such plague, surely, is disinformation. For all the promise and progress of technology, much of humanity now carries with them a personal device that can misinform, deceive, and divide as easily as it can educate, enlighten, and connect. Conspiracy theories are not harmless entertainment. They can undermine confidence in institutions, unduly influence democratic outcomes, and set one group of people against another. Does anyone doubt, after the last few years, that conspiracy theories can kill? Here again is a challenge no one country can solve alone. And those of us who cherish democratic freedoms of expression have a particular responsibility to cooperate in fighting for truth and transparency. Friends, COVID has ravaged our economies. Too many countries in the hemisphere have been neglected. We are grateful for the millions of doses of vaccines, but we must be mindful that the migration of healthcare professionals from the Caribbean to developed countries has been devastating for our healthcare systems. The Caribbean has lost healthcare professionals to the United States and Canada amid the worst pandemic of our life, making it harder to care for our own people. So I joined Prime Minister Belize in gratitude to the Cubans who came to our rescue in providing much-needed personnel. Friends, the dialogue and agreements which will emerge from this gathering are necessary precursors to much-needed action. Major conflicts around the world are made worse by the erosion of democracy in many corners. How we engage with countries where democratic values are declining is a major challenge of our times. It is easy to talk with those whom we agree, but we must also be able to talk to those with whom we don't agree. In fact, sometimes those are the conversations that are most urgently needed. All the countries in our hemisphere face overlapping developmental, security, and democratic challenges. Collaboration and collective action can only be of mutual benefit. The absence of the Republic of Cuba has made these deliberations less complete. We strongly affirm the need to always lead with consultation and diplomatic engagement, which is why we support efforts to breathe new life into the Inter-American Democratic Charter. The embargo against our Cuban neighbors, the longest such embargo in modern history, directly contributes to a rise in irregular migration, which heavily impacts my country. The easing of restrictions in 2016 led to a dramatic fall in irregular migration, a very welcome development for the Bahamas. We deeply regret its rescission and the corresponding rise in irregular migration which accompanied it. We also believe that more can be done to provide support for our brothers and sisters in Haiti. But that said, we also believe that this engagement must be led by the government and people of Haiti. For too long, the approach in the region has been about us, without us. We must commit to new tools and more focused engagement. Over the long term, we must also be mindful of the unintended consequences of isolation and separation. When we push away those with whom we disagree, they often take comfort in one another and deepen their alliances in the face of our hostility. A former American national security advisor described this as an alliance of the aggrieved. And such alliances can challenge our peace and security and disrupt other relationships. Friends, apart from the irregular movement of people, which I mentioned a few moments ago, the Bahamas is also being hard hit by the illegal transshipment of guns. We do not manufacture guns. Not a single gun is made in the Bahamas. We have witnessed an explosion in gun-related crimes that far too often end up in injury or murder. I strongly urge those states in the region which manufacture guns to continue to work closely with us to contain them within their own borders and do what you can to prevent such harmful proliferation. Surely, the right to bear arms cannot be interpreted as the right to traffic arms. Friends, in conclusion, we need to keep talking. We all need to keep talking. And we also need to keep doing, upholding our commitments and taking the action necessary for our collective survival. Often, it is when the talking stops that the fighting starts. And it's only when the talking starts that the fighting stops. If the institutions within our inter-American system are no longer fit for purpose, then let's rethink or recalibrate to whatever degree necessary in order that they may fulfill their potential. The Bahamas believes that the OAS in particular requires both a structural and cultural adjustment. Membership in any organization bestows privileges, but membership also confers responsibilities. And a basic expectation must be that members make good faith efforts to keep resourcing commitments to the organization. For almost a decade, staffing, projects, and programming at the organization have deteriorated. The OAS is, in many areas, a shell of its former self. My country's mission to the OAS has been charged with focusing on necessary OAS reform. We hope that other countries will join our efforts. Let this gathering fulfill its mission to drive change in the region for the better of us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. The chair now recognizes the Honorable Mia Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados.
Bless my eyes this morning. Gaston is on the rise again. The way earthly things are going, anything can happen. Mr. Secretary, there is so much trouble in the world. Excellencies, there is so much trouble in the world. Heads of government, there is so much trouble in the world. Heads of state, there is so much trouble in the world. I've chosen the language of Bob Marley this morning, not because I'm an apostle of Bob, as you probably have realized by now, but also because he reminds us of the day-to-day reality of our people and of our citizens. And we have come to Los Angeles hopeful that we're not just going to engage in speeches, or we're not just going to engage in platitudes, but we go home to make a difference to people at perhaps the most difficult time this world has seen in 100 years. We have 3 global crises, and any one is sufficient to bring us down. The climate crisis hurts from you here in California in fires, to us in the Caribbean through the heart attack of hurricanes, and the chronic NCDs of water crises and droughts, or floods, depending on where you go. We fight the pandemic. And even as we talk about the pandemic, we need to start to qualify it, because we fight the COVID pandemic without realizing that the slow onset pandemic of antimicrobial resistance is already upon us, being fueled further by how we farm, how we treat each other with the abuse of antibiotics, and how we literally allow those things to flow into our environment and contaminate our water system. And as if that was not enough, we now fight the prices of food and fuel and fertilizer, knowing full well that the only destination thereafter is going to be a debt crisis and an economic crisis if we do not intervene to break the slide. My friends, how much more evidence do we need? You see men sailing on their ego trip, blast off on their spaceship, million miles from reality. No care for you, no care for me. If I could have sung it, you would have joined me. But I don't need you to join me in the words of this song. I need you to join us in the chorus of action that our people need, not want. Our people need immediate intervention. 6-week crops and 12-week crops is what is going to feed our people. We need to be able to shield them from the price of fertilizer that is making their efforts almost impossible. We need equally to recognize, as you heard Prime Minister Brown and Prime Minister Davis say already this morning, that the debt crisis is already among many developing countries. We simply do not have the fiscal space to respond to crises not spawned by ourselves, but spawned by others. And we are facing a double jeopardy. Our countries were those from whom wealth was extracted in order to build the developed world. Our countries were left at independence with no compact, no money to finance basic rights of housing and health care and education. And when we fought to do it, now we find ourselves having those efforts crowded out, literally, by our inability to be able to face and find the money because we are using it to recover from climate crises, not of our own making. Where does the double jeopardy come? That it is the very industrial revolution that the blood, sweat, and tears of our ancestors financed that is now causing us not to be able to respond to the needs of our people in the most basic of ways that humanity requires. My friends, there is so much trouble in the world, and we think we've found a solution, but we want to tell people only about financing after the climate crisis. We need to be able to prepare before the crisis so we can reduce what we have to spend by 7 times. We need to recognize that adaptation has no private sector follower because there's no return on investment in adapting to the climate realities. That is the function of the state. And therefore, the international community is required in the justice of the moment to help us prevent loss of life and property for a crisis we didn't create. We need to reform the international financial institutions architecture. How can we have an international bank for reconstruction and development that does not reconstruct and develop in today's world? Where is the reconstruction from the climate crisis being financed? Where is the reconstruction from the pandemic being financed, the post-pandemic recovery? Where is the platform for middle-income countries that house 75% of the world's poor? But because they're middle income, we don't remember that. Where is the climate finance being targeted to, justifiably and fairly so, when the numbers show that only 15% of climate finance is going to the climate vulnerable countries? I've not come here just to use words. Let us be practical. We have a duty to solve a few problems. And I think that the format of this meeting needs to change if we are to be able to see real progress and not simply to be part of the problem. We need to talk with each other and not talk at each other as we are doing in set piece speeches. We need to engage and see how we can make a difference in a real way. We have migrants coming not because they choose to come, but because it is their last option. They don't choose to leave who they love and where they love willingly. And when they come, we now know that we don't need to treat them poorly, because this year has shown that there's a dignified way to treat migrants. We've seen that in Europe. We need to see it in the Americas. And I don't place that burden on the United States of America alone. I place it on all of us including my own country, because we cannot be part of the solution by simply talking from outside and not literally putting our shoulders to the plow. The International Organization of Migrants needs our support. And we need to make sure that as we reform the Organization of American States, that instead of it seeking to become a political player, it needs to become a player that simply brings opportunity to our people in the Americas, from Alaska to Chile. And how does that come? If we did nothing else in the next decade in the OAS, but to allow our people to become bilingual and trilingual, people under 18 and adults, then we would change the economic possibilities of this hemisphere in ways that we can't even contemplate. We need to ensure that if we fight this climate crisis injustice, then we fight it not just as small island developing states and developing countries calling for fairness for our nations, but we provide that fairness to our people. And how do I mean? We have taken a decision in Barbados that there can be no award of any contracts for renewable energy without taking into account the bounty that must go to our people. And therefore, accordingly, this year I announced that every rooftop that is owned by anyone in Barbados will have the right to have placed on it, as of right, not a choice, not a right to apply, as of right, photovoltaic systems from 2.5 kilowatts to 5 to 10 to 20. Why? Because we don't own individually the wind, the sea, and the sun. It is the patrimony of the nation. And if we are to move our people out of poverty, then we must use the bounty that is afforded to us through renewable energy, good jobs, but also good investment to allow our people to benefit. And we ask you to recognize that we must not only engage in platitudinous comments about what we can achieve with net zero. Net zero does not mean fossil fuel free. It means still that there will be 20% energy coming from fossil fuels. We know natural gas is that clean fuel. But as we do it, let us recognize that it is not possible to exclude those developing countries who have now the opportunity to finance their way to net zero simply because we want to keep the world in the construct of the old imperial order in which it is found. Whether it is the reform of the international financial institutions or whether it is moving ourselves into a new reality, we cannot continue to cement the inequalities of an old imperial order. And that is why I've come also to thank President Biden and Vice President Harris. For too long, there has been benign neglect. And the Partnership for the Americas, as well as the Climate Partnership Pact 2030, offers us a real possibility of hope. But it is up to each of us to keep and hold each other accountable. We are happy that coming out of yesterday, we made progress that we didn't see the day before. And we hope that tomorrow we will build on the subcommittees that will make a real difference on energy security, food security, and finance access that will mean that we can look our people in the face and say we have done right by you. We cannot achieve it overnight, but we are moving in the right direction. And we must also address the reality of exclusion. Not only exclusion of individuals in our society through racism and class prejudice, but exclusion of countries from the ability to participate in the financial system by having us de-risked, by having correspondent banks. Belize, 83% of its banks have been de-risked. How do the people of Belize do trade with the rest of the world, with the United States of America, if their people can't bank, can't send remittances, if we are told that our institutions are too small to matter, and therefore it is better not to do business with us? Are we to become financial pariahs in a world at the same time that we seek to bring equity? There is so much trouble in this world. If we think we've found a solution, it must not, in the words of Bob, be another illusion. We ask you to also recognize that let us use our cooperative efforts to build joint platforms for procurement so that we can reduce the price of critical goods, from vaccines to water pipes to all other kinds of things that are impairing our ability to deliver proper services to our people. Africa did it with the African Medical Supplies Platform. Why can't we have an American supplies platform that treats to the most critical supplies? And why? In the Caribbean, we make an order and they say, what? That's too small for us. We announced a tax holiday for electric vehicles. We cannot get the supply of electric vehicles. Will Brazil help us? Will India help us? Will the United States or will Canada help us? We can't get access to batteries in order to help us become net zero by 2030. But yet we want to come on these platforms and talk about it. These are the real problems that I hope PAC 2030 will allow us to solve. And when we finish with PAC 2030, Canada and Chile and all of the others, can we create that platform for that joint procurement to reduce the price of supplies and to guarantee access to our people? My friends, I've spoken too long, but I cannot leave this platform without saying that we have to speak some home truths to each other. It's wrong that Cuba and Venezuela, Nicaragua are not here because, as you heard from Bahamas, that we need to speak with those with whom we disagree. And we don't only need to narrowcast. That's the part of the problem of the world. There's too much narrowcasting instead of broadcasting. There's too much talking at instead of talking with. But secondly, those countries must equally recognize that you cannot want to fully participate if you're not prepared equally to engage and to see progress. And the simple priority must be people, not ideology. If we can make progress for people, if we can allow people to speak different languages, if we can create a minimum floor of education and healthcare for the people of the Americas, then, my friends, the City of Angels would have played its role in the history of the Americas. I hope that we leave here today conscious that we must never again come to a summit to talk at each other, but simply to talk with each other in partnership and for the purpose of the prosperity of our people. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Prime Minister. In the words of Bob, no woman, no cry. Don't shed no tears. Let's act. We can sing a redemption song together. Thank you. The chair now recognizes His Excellency, Jair Bolsonaro, President of the Federal Republic of Brazil. Mr. President.
Mr. Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State,
Senhores chefes de Estado e de Governo,
Chiefs of State and of
Sr. Luiz
Government,
Almagro, Secretário-Geral
Mr. Luiz
da
Almagro,
Organização dos Estados
Secretary
Americanos,
General of the Organization of
prezado
American
deputado
States,
Arthur Lira, presidente da Câmara dos
Congressman
Deputados do
Arthur
Brasil,
Lira, the Speaker of
e
the
ministros
House
que
in
me
Brazil,
acompanham.
and ministers
Senhoras
with
e
me.
senhores,
Ladies and gentlemen,
agradeço o convite
I thank you
dos Estados
for
Unidos
your
para
invitation
participar
from the United
dessa
States
reunião
to
de líderes
participate in
democráticos
this
das
meeting
Américas.
of democratic leaders in the Americas.
A Cúpula das Américas é a
The
oportunidade
Summit
para
of the
tratarmos
Americas
os
is the
desafios da
opportunity to
pós-pandemia,
deal with the challenges of the
desenvolvimento sustentável,
post-pandemic of sustainable
transição
development
energética,
with
da
the energy
transformação digital,
transition,
da imigração,
digital
bem como da
transformation,
democracia e dos direitos
integration,
humanos.
as well as democracy and human rights.
Estamos atentos aos
We
problemas
are
econômicos
very
que afetam o mundo,
attentive
como a inflação,
to the economic
desemprego
problems affecting the
e,
world, like
principalmente,
inflation,
ao bem
unemployment, and
mais
especially
precioso para o
the
ser
most
humano,
precious
a sua
good
liberdade,
for the human
aí
being,
incluídos a liberdade
his
de
or her
expressão,
freedom,
de trabalho e
including
de culto
the freedom
religioso.
of expression, of work,
O Brasil
and
se
faith.
engajou fortemente
Brazil has
no
engaged
processo
strongly
negociador
in the
das
negotiating
declarações a
process
serem discutidas e
within
aprovadas
the
nessa
declarations
cúpula.
to be approved in this summit. We are going to work together so these proposals lead to new cooperation engines for the economic growth of the Americas. Brazil feeds 1 billion people. We ensure food security for 1/6 of the world population. Without our agribusiness, half of the world would be hungry. Brazil not only avoided a food crisis with the access to fertilizers, but also they had a role of developing, looking for solutions on the world for food security. We are one of the countries that most preserve the environment and its forests. We have the most diversified and developed energetic matrix in the world, even losing part of our native forests, but only using 27% of our territory for cattle raising and agriculture. We are a sustainable agricultural nation. We do not need the Amazon region to expand our agribusiness. Only in the Amazon biome, 84% of the forest is intact, holding the greatest biodiversity in the planet. Our challenges are proportional to our size. I remind you that the area of the Amazon is equivalent to the area of the entire Western Europe. No other country has a environmental legislation so complete. Our forest code should be an example to other countries. In fact, we are responsible for less than 20% of the carbon emissions, even being the 9th economy in the world. In order to protect our forests, the federal government has reinforced combating deforestation and has established activities to preserve the biome in the Amazon. With the launch of the Methane Zero program, we have implemented commitments established during COP6 to structure treatment of organic residues, milk products, and landfills in order to reduce 30% of the emissions of methane in Brazil. We are pioneers in energetic transition. We started decarbonization more than half a century ago with biofuels and other sources. In 2021, we hit the record of installation of wind energy, 21 gigawatts, and sun power with 14. 85% of the energy generated in Brazil comes from renewable sources. We have the potential to additional production of energy of 60 gigawatts, equivalent to 4 times our installed capacity, or 50 Itaipu power plants. The wind power generation in the Northeast can generate ammonia for export. In this moment that many developed countries use fuels, we promote totally clean energy and totally devoid of emissions. We see in Brazil now, in part of the world, we clear attack to the freedom of human beings to opine in different ways. I leave here a message for the Americas as a prosperous and democratic region. We have participated in many hemispheric forums working for democracy, for freedom
prosperidade
for
econômica e
prosperity,
social.
economic and social.
Neste ano em que o Brasil
In this
comemora
year in which
200
Brazil
anos de independência,
celebrates
afirmamos que
200
temos
years
governo
of
que
independence,
acredita em Deus,
we are a country
respeita os
that
seus militares,
believes in God, respects its
favorável à
military,
vida
is favorable
desde a
to
sua
life
concepção,
since its
defende a
conception,
família
defends
e
the
deve
family,
lealdade ao seu
and
povo.
gives loyalty to
No Brasil,
its
já se
own
entende
people.
que a
Brazil, we
liberdade
understand
é bem
that
maior
freedom
que a própria
is a
vida,
higher
pois o homem ou mulher
good
sem
than
liberdade
life itself,
não
because
tem vida.
men and women without freedom
Me
have no
permitem,
life.
antes de concluir,
Before
algumas informações de
concluding,
interesse
I
de
would
todos
give
nós.
you some information that is
E
of
podemos
interest
ver
to all
no
of
mundo.
us that we can
Desde o
share
último
with the
domingo,
world. From
quando
last
tivemos a
Sunday,
informação
when we
que
had
dois
the
cidadãos,
information that two citizens,
britânico, Dom
one
Phillips,
British,
e
Don
brasileiro,
Phillips,
Bruno
and a
Araújo,
Brazilian, Bruno Araújo,
desapareceram na região do Vale do
disappeared
Javari
in
desde
the
o primeiro
Valley
momento, naquele mesmo domingo.
Javari
As nossas
Vale
Forças
in the
Armadas
Amazon
e
region.
Polícia Federal
From that moment on,
têm se
our
destacado
military,
na
the
busca
armed
incansável
forces,
pela
have
localização
started
dessas
a
pessoas.
search to
Pedimos
find
a Deus
those people. We ask
que
God
sejam encontrados com
that
vidas.
they may be found
Dois,
alive.
dizer a todos
Two, I'd like to say
que o
to
Brasil
everybody
é um
that Brazil,
que continua
that
concedendo vistos
continues
humanitários
to concede
a
humanitarian
haitianos,
visas to
ucranianos,
Afghans,
sírios
Ukrainians,
venezuelanos.
Syrians, and
Falar pouco do
Venezuelans.
potencial nosso, das
We
Américas.
do have a
Prezado
potential
Marito,
in the
o
Americas
nosso lago de Itaipu,
of
brevemente,
the activities in
estará
our
apto à piscicultura,
Itaipu
onde
Lake
somente pelo lado
or
brasileiro
reservoir, where
nós
we will be
ampliaremos
also dedicating it
a
to
nossa
grow
oferta de
fish,
mercado em
and we
torno de
will be able
40%.
to
Assim
present
tem
to the market
tratado com Vossa
40%
Excelência o nosso
of
secretário
the
da
supply.
Pesca, Jorge
This
Seixas.
Secretary of Fisheries,
Dizendo ao presidente
George State,
argentino,
has done this,
prezado
and I
Fernandes,
would like to also
continua
tell
em
the
frente
President of
o nosso
Argentina,
acordo de
our
gás
dear
de vaca
Fernandes,
morta.
continues
Pode ter
in our
certeza, será bom
discussions
para os nossos dois países.
that
E nós
this
não
agreement
deixaremos
in
de
gas
continuar importando
will
gás
continue for both of our countries and will continue to import
Da
gas
Bolívia.
from Bolivia.
Dizer também
I would also like
aos
to
prezados
say
presidentes
to
da
all
Guiana e
the from the presidents from Guyana and
que a nossa
Suriname
ida
that
recentemente aos seus
our
países visa
visit to our
colaborar na
recent
exploração de
visit
petróleo e
to
gás
our
dos
countries
seus países.
is intended
Os
to
senhores
collaborate
têm algo
with the
fantástico
oil and
que
gas
Deus lhes
situation in
deu.
your countries.
Reservas em óleo e gás
You have
equivalente
reserves
a
in oil and gas
90%
equivalent to
das reservas
90% of
brasileiras.
the
Tenho
Brazilian
certeza
reserves.
que
I am
juntos
sure that
com outros
together
parceiros bem
with other
escolhidos,
partners,
os seus países
your
realmente
countries
se despontarão no cenário
will
econômico
finally
mundial.
have
Dizer
be
que ontem
highlighted in the world
estive
scenery.
com o presidente Biden
Today
numa
I was
bilateral ampliada e depois numa mais
President
reservada.
Biden with the
Pouquíssimas pessoas.
extended
Ficamos por 30
bilateral
minutos
and also in a reserved
sentados,
one. We
uma
were for
distância inferior
30
de 1 metro e
minutes
sem máscara.
seated
Sentindo o
without a
presidente
mask
muita
and
sinceridade,
less than a meter
muita
away.
vontade
And I
de
felt from
resolver certos problemas
Mr. Biden
que fogem,
need
obviamente, de total
to
responsabilidade de cada de nós.
solve
Mas,
problems that,
juntos,
including
poderemos
some that
buscar
are not on
alternativas
our
para
responsibility,
pôr
but
fim
we're able to
nesses
discuss
conflitos.
alternatives
E eu
to
acredito
end
que
the
todos
conflicts
trabalhando dessa
in the
maneira,
world, and
atingiremos
all of us
os
working in
nossos
this
objetivos.
manner will
Em
reach
especial,
objectives,
o governo
especially
americano. A
with
experiência de
the
ontem,
U.S.
com o
government.
Biden,
The
foi
experience
simplesmente
that I
fantástica.
had yesterday with
Estou
President
realmente
Biden
maravilhado
was
e
tremendous.
acreditando
I am
em suas
very
palavras
relieved.
e
I
naquilo
believe
que foi
his words,
tratado
and I
reservadamente
believe
e reservado.
in what
A
we
todos, muito
reservedly
obrigado
dealt
e que
with.
Deus
To all of
abençoe
you,
os nossos
thank you very
países.
much, and may God bless our countries.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The chair now yields to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Javier Becerra of the United States, to preside as chair. Javier.
We must ensure that we have strong institutions and take action to strengthen them further. As the region's premier multilateral forum, the Organization of American States is uniquely qualified to promote our values and facilitate cooperation. This week, Canada endorses the United States-America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity. We believe that this partnership responds to hemispheric priorities and that it will provide us with more tools to tackle inequality and grow the economy and the middle class. When peace, stability, and prosperity are threatened by an illegal and unjustifiable war, it is a global concern. I visited Ukraine last month to express my support in person to President Zelensky and to the Ukrainian people. I saw the devastation firsthand. I want to thank our partners here who continue to send strong signals of support for Ukraine. As you know, Russia's actions have consequences not only in Eastern Europe, but throughout the world, particularly in the global south. Consequences like food shortages. In Ukraine, the grain elevators are full. They had a record harvest crop last year. Now, Ukraine is expected to have a crop 1/3 smaller than last year because of the war. And Russia is blocking it from getting out. As you all know, there are no sanctions on food. We need to counter and continue to counter Russian disinformation at every turn. Canada recognizes the negative impact of this crisis on economies and on food security in our hemisphere, and will be there to help, both with short and longer-term solutions. We'll also continue to do our part to respond to COVID-19. Already, we've invested $11.5 million to support countries in the region through the Pan American Health Organization and through our embassies and high commissions. And we're providing an additional $50 million to the organization's pandemic response, as well as over 760,000 vaccine doses.
As we keep fighting against this pandemic, we need to improve resilience of our health systems. We need to ensure that they can respond to the needs of all, especially those who are most vulnerable. Because a better future is a future where no one is left behind. This is why Canada encourages the equality of genders in its diplomatic initiative, in its commercial initiatives, and in its development
governments to promote the human rights of women, girls, gender-diverse people, and LGBTQ2 communities. Everyone should be able to live a life free of discrimination and to be able to make their own choices for their own bodies. And everyone should have the opportunity to reach their full potential. Advancing rights and economic empowerment for everyone must always include Indigenous peoples. Their voices need to be heard in summits like these, and we call on other countries to support their meaningful participation. Because when more diverse voices are heard, everyone benefits. That's why it's so important to continue fighting for our democratic values. Around the world, we've seen a rise in authoritarianism and a backsliding of democracy. Canada is
determined to work with its partners in order to improve resilience of our democracies. With Panama, we are proud to co-chair the working group on the Inter-American Action Plan on democratic governance. We are also encouraging a larger adhesion to organizations like the Coalition for Freedom Online that Canada is chairing this year. In this way, we will be able to better fight against disinformation, misinformation, and dangerous content online, while promoting inclusion in the digital space.
Prime Minister Motley of Barbados has long been telling us that smaller island nations are struggling to deal with a triple crisis that includes COVID-19, rising fuel and food prices, and climate change. Our international financial architecture was designed long before the challenges we now face, including this climate crisis. We need to work together to think creatively to address climate risks that more vulnerable countries are facing. Canada supports concessional financing for these at-risk middle-income countries, including small island developing states, so that they can build resilience. And I want to thank Mia and others for their leadership on this front. At every forum, from the Francophonie to Commonwealth to the OAS to the G7, the G20, APEC and others, Canada will always be there to speak up for countries who aren't at the table and who are particularly vulnerable to events beyond their control. Les pays des Amériques partagent des océans.
The countries of the Americas share oceans. We are tied by agreements that foster innovation, and we have a common future. At this summit, Canada worked with Chile on an initiative to protect the Pacific Ocean. I'm delighted to see that many other countries in the Americas are adhering to this. It is our responsibility to ensure that our waters remain intact, and same for our air.
The world to get to 60% of global emissions covered by pollution pricing by 2030. I salute those of you who've already put a price on pollution in your countries. I invite all others to join in that challenge. Whether it's fighting climate change, strengthening our economies, keeping people safe, or addressing the impacts and root causes of irregular migration, building a better future requires efforts. And this wouldn't be possible without strong inter-American institutions and democracies. So again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for your words, for your leadership, for your engagement even when it's difficult. And I very much look forward to continuing to work with all of you. Merci, mes amis.
Thank you, dear friends.
Thank you, Prime Minister. The Chair now recognizes His Excellency Gabriel Boric, President of the Republic of Chile.
Vengo de Chile.
I come from Chile.
Específicamente desde la Patagonia.
From Patagonia.
Desde el sur de nuestro continente,
the southern part of our continent,
se inicia.
Where the continent begins.
Y en Chile,
and in Chile,
como quizás algunos de
as
ustedes
perhaps
saben,
some of you know,
estamos en este momento
we are
en medio de un profundo proceso
in the middle of
de cambios, de transformaciones,
deep-seated process
que no
of change and
exento de
transformation that is not without its difficulties. A process of change
en la protesta social,
that began with social protests
en el seno de nuestro pueblo,
in the heart of our people.
En medio de la crisis quizás más importante que hemos
in the middle of
tenido
perhaps
durante
the
las
most
últimas
difficult
décadas,
challenge we've faced in the last few
optamos por
decades,
resolverla
we
con más
decided
democracia
to solve it
y no
with
con menos.
more democracy and
Y
not
de
with
eso
less.
justamente
And
se trata el
that
proceso
is exactly what
que hoy
the
está en marcha en
constitutional
nuestro país,
process is about that is currently underway in our country. It is equal, democratic, with the involvement of native peoples, and it will end with a referendum on September 4th of this year.
Y lo menciono porque creemos
I bring this
firmemente en la
up
democracia,
because we firmly
en el
believe
libre
in
intercambio de
democracy,
ideas,
in the free exchange of ideas,
donde, como decía
where,
Mia, la presidenta
as
Mia de
Mia
Barbados,
said, President Mia from Barbados, where we may be able not only be able to speak to other people, but to speak with other people, to find each other, to share, to persuade each other. And that is why we are here in Los Angeles. And I would like to thank President Biden for this invitation. We are here to dialogue, to listen. And that is why we have the deep-seated conviction, as many presidents who have preceded me have said, for this to truly work, there can be no exclusions. We should all be here, and not all of us are here. And I don't like this. I don't like the exclusion of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And you know why? Because it would be different to, in a forum like this one, with every country present, even those who decided to not come because of this exclusion. There's an urgent need to free the political prisoners in Nicaragua. And there is a moral and practical importance of putting an end to the unjust and unacceptable embargo of Cuba by the United States for once and for all. It's important that when we disagree, as you have all said, we need to be able to speak to each other face to face. This only promotes isolation, and it does not deliver, as we have learned from history. For our country, we want to say this very clearly. Human rights, the unrestricted respect for human rights is a basic concept of civilization that we will always promote, regardless of the political stripe of the country that violates them. And we must also include ourselves in this. That is why we understand ourselves to be a feminist administration that defends the human rights of women, of girls, and of dissidents everywhere. In this area, unfortunately, we believe that our agreements are insufficient and that we must make rapid progress, much faster progress. This is not tolerable, my dear colleagues. On our continent, for there to be places where history is being denied. That is why we are using this forum in order to invite the few countries that are still not a part of the Belém do Pará Convention to prevent, eradicate, and sanction all violence against women. We invite them to become a part of this effort so that half of our continent, the women of our countries, may live in an environment that is free of violence. Let us take concrete actions, my dear colleagues. This is urgent. We must make progress with full political inclusion for women. That is, we need parity. There must be autonomy when it comes to women's bodies, and as I have said before, a life free of violence. It is with this conviction and this sense of urgency that in this space, we have, together with other countries, also taken on initiatives in order to protect the oceans, a coalition in the Americas for the protection of the oceans, as the Prime Minister of Canada said, Justin Trudeau. At this summit comes from Canada, Panama, the United States, Mexico, Peru, Costa Rica, Colombia, Ecuador, and Chile are a part of this. The protection of our oceans is an act of survival. And therefore, we must take this very, very seriously. Countries that are not yet developed, we cannot wait for developed countries, for China, for India, for the United States, for Europe. We cannot wait for them to be more decided and get on board with protection for the environment all over the world and carbon neutrality. We must be the example, and that is exactly what we're doing with this Coalition for the Protection of Oceans, because it is clear to us, as the president of our Antigua and Barbuda stated, that if we do not change our direction, our very existence as humankind is threatened. And we must do this together. We cannot do this separately. This is something that many of you, I believe, have already said. We either save ourselves together or we will all sink separately. And there, we must learn from what has happened to us just recently. It's not possible that in the middle of a pandemic, the worst pandemic that we have faced, the COVID-19 pandemic, that we've had to compete for vaccines. Who gets there first? We must work together in that regard, because if in another country there is a low vaccination rate, that obviously affects us as well. For whom does the bell toll? It tolls for thee. We must, acting together also requires the richest countries, Canada has said, and we appreciate this. The position such as in the G7 or the G20, these countries need to be the most committed. They must play the role that is theirs, both within our countries as with international cooperation, which is crucial to face this challenge. Humbly then, from Chile, we are asking developed countries to reach the goal that they set for themselves in the 70s, the Commission for Assistance for Development to target 0.7% of their wealth to cooperation. Many developed countries are still far from meeting this goal that they set for themselves. We urge you from the South, from America, to make faster progress in meeting that challenge. To this end, we also believe that it is necessary to work on a global tax pact. The example of the United States is set by President Biden, or President Fernandez has also discussed this from Argentina. There needs to be an end once and for all to tax havens that have so gravely damaged the entire world, and especially our hemisphere. My dear colleagues, countries must be attractive to foreign investment from companies, because we enforce the laws, because we respect treaties, because of the human capital we have, our education, our training, and our commitment to green and clean economies, but not because of low environmental standards or labor standards, not because there is suicidal competition when it comes to tax breaks. So let us work together